So I'm Jocelyn Hendrickson, and I'm an associate professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. And I'll be talking to you today about my new book, Leaving Iberia, Islamic Law and Christian Conquest in Northwest Africa. It came out with the program in Islamic Law at Harvard University Press in 2021. Basically, I was interested in what Islamic legal sources had to say about Muslims living as minority religious communities in majority non-Muslim countries or territories. And that initial interest when I got started was inspired by contemporary discussions of fiqh al-aqliyat, or the jurisprudence of Muslim minorities. At the time, there were estimates that about a third of the world's Muslims live as members of religious minority communities around the world. And those communities were debating a lot of really interesting and important questions related to whether and how Islamic law could be adapted to their circumstances and who it is that has the authority to make those kinds of decisions. So I was curious about the contemporary phenomenon, but I wanted to conduct my own research on a historical example. So I wanted to know if there was a historic precedent for this modern debate. And I very quickly found that all arrows point toward the Iberian Peninsula. The fall of al-Andalus, also known as the Christian reconquest of Iberia, is often described as a turning point in Islamic history when some of the first substantial Muslim populations fell under permanent Christian rule. So Muslims had ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 800 years, beginning in 711, when Muslim armies first crossed into Iberia from North Africa. Starting in the late 11th century, the Christian kingdoms in Iberia gradually expanded at the expense of the Muslim kingdoms until the 1492 surrender of Granada, which had been the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. For nearly 400 years during this period of conquest, many Muslims emigrated as their territories were conquered, but many stayed. So large, well-established populations of Iberian Muslims remained where they were and are known as mudejars. That's the term for Muslims living under Christian rule who were allowed to practice Islam. Beginning in 1500, Muslims were forcibly converted to Christianity in Granada, and then after that in the rest of the peninsula. And that population, known as Moriscos, are generally considered to be clandestine Muslims who were forced to act as Christians externally, but who maintained their Muslim identity in secret. And the Moriscos were later expelled from Spain in the early 17th century. So this centuries-long process of Christian conquests in Iberia posed a number of difficult new legal questions for Muslim jurists, including, most crucially, the very permissibility of Muslim residence under non-Muslim rule. And the advent of these questions is all the more interesting because in this period, the jurists had so little precedent to rely on in trying to answer these questions. During the formative centuries of Islamic law, the Islamic Empire had always been expanding, and Muslims were simply assumed to live under Muslim law. So these later jurists at the time of the Reconquest were supposed to ground their legal positions in established doctrines, but the issue of Muslims living under permanent Christian rule had just not arisen in a sustained way. And when I started this research, quite a few scholars had been interested in this issue of how Muslim jurists responded to the Reconquest. But I found that they were only discussing a small handful of legal opinions or fatwas. And what I hoped to go out and do was conduct a more thorough search in North African manuscript libraries in particular, and see if I could find additional legal opinions to shed more light on this historical case of Muslims living under Christian rule. A few arguments, but really I think the most central one is that Muslim jurists in the 14th and 15th centuries were very concerned about Portuguese conquests in North Africa. They were not solely focused on the fall of al-Andalus or the fate of Iberian Muslims. In fact, I argue that the most famous fatwa about conquered Andalusi Muslims, issued by a jurist named Ahmed al-Wantarisi, is actually a veiled commentary on the situation in Morocco itself at the time. And to explain this argument a little better, I'll first say a little more about al-Wantarisi's fatwas. So Ahmed al-Wantarisi was the chief mufti of Fez, where he worked and died in 1508. And he is best known as the compiler of a 12-volume fatwa compilation, Al-Yar, that became a standard reference work in the Maliki school of law. In this compilation, al-Wantarisi included a few of his own opinions, most notably Esna al-Matajir and the Marbella fatwa, which are the two most prominent fatwas on the issue of conquered Muslims' obligation to emigrate. And al-Wantarisi composed both of these fatwas in 1491, just before that final surrender of Granada. In the first one, Esna al-Matajir, al-Wantarisi is asked by a fellow Maghribi jurist about a group of Andalusi Muslims who had abandoned everything and expended great effort in order to emigrate. They left Iberia and landed somewhere in the Maghrib, presumably in what is modern-day Morocco. And unfortunately, after completing their hijrah or emigration, these Andalusis were unable to find security or prosperity. They regretted their emigration, and they began to openly curse the Maghrib, and they expressed a desire to return to Castile. And the questioner in this fatwa asks al-Wantarisi to clarify whether or not the obligation to emigrate is contingent on material comfort. That's clearly a rhetorical question. And he asks what punishment these Andalusis deserve for their offenses. In the second fatwa, the Marbella fatwa, the same questioner asks al-Wantarisi about a man who wants to remain behind in Iberia in order to help others deal with the Christian authorities. In both of these texts and his answers, al-Wantarisi supports the obligation of conquered Muslims to emigrate to Muslim territory, as long as they're capable of doing so. There are some exceptions for people who are not capable. And he presents his most detailed case for emigration in Esna al-Matajir, where he cites dozens of Quran verses, hadith reports, and a variety of legal precedents. And what I found most striking about this opinion when I was reading it is that when al-Wantarisi arrives at the specific punishments these Andalusis deserve, he describes one of their main offenses as fitna, or the spread of corrupting ideas, and he recommends an exemplary punishment. And so what I realized is that these unhappy immigrants probably had landed in court in the Maghrib, and a jurist associated with their case must have written to al-Wantarisi for his opinion about what to do with them. So against the assumption that al-Wantarisi was trying to encourage Iberian Muslims to emigrate, and that these fatwas were meant to circulate in Iberia, and that he was condemning Muslims who stayed in Iberia, I actually don't think this is the case at all. I think these Andalusi immigrants in the question probably didn't see this fatwa. It probably didn't circulate, and I think this is really about an offense taking place in the Maghrib in front of a Maghribi audience. And what al-Wantarisi is really concerned about is preventing these ideas that Christian rule is preferable to Muslim rule from spreading in the Maghrib. So although we have focused almost exclusively on the Mudejar phenomenon, Muslims living under Christian authority was a pressing concern in Morocco itself in the 15th century. Long before the 1492 fall of Granada to Castile, Portugal launched its overseas conquests by taking the Mediterranean port of Ceuta in 1415. And for over a century, Portugal expanded its holdings, capturing most of Morocco's Mediterranean and Atlantic ports and controlling their associated hinterlands before a long period of contraction started in the early 16th century, where Portugal very slowly and gradually withdrew from all of these holdings that had been built up from the early 15th century to the early 16th century. So as it turns out, Maghribi Muslims, including al-Wantarisi, wrote quite a few legal responses to these Portuguese Iberian conquest in North Africa itself. And these opinions had been overlooked by people interested in this question of Muslims under Christian rule, in part because al-Matrisi didn't include them in his vast compilation. They are not in the Ma'yar. Instead, they're preserved in this 17th century fatwa compilation that is still unpublished, compiled by a jurist called al-Zayati, entitled Al-Jawahir al-Mukhtara, or Selected Jewels. And in the book, I analyze this neglected body of opinions, which treats the status of Muslims who cooperate with the Portuguese in various ways. And I argue that these fatwas are really important for a few reasons. They show Islamic legal texts acting as a form of indigenous resistance to European empire in the 15th century. They help overturn a very Eurocentric focus in our understanding of Iberian-Muslim relations in this period. They challenge a perception of Iberian exceptionalism, and they force us to rethink these better-known opinions about the obligation to emigrate in this period. So the legal discourse regarding Portuguese occupation took place just before al-Matrisi wrote his more famous opinions, obligating Andalusian Muslims to emigrate. And it's in light of these earlier opinions that I reinterpret al-Mahdi as a veiled commentary on the Portuguese occupation of the Maghreb and on the dangers of openly preferring Christian rule to Muslim sovereignty. As a final note here, I want to say that the history of Islam and Muslims in Iberia is indeed really fascinating, and there is much about that history that is unique. For example, the size and longevity of a Muslim population in Europe, and the intermingling of Jews, Christians, and Muslims together for a sustained period of time. There are aspects of medieval Iberia that are unique, but that doesn't make Iberia's Muslims uniquely worthy of study. We must not be blinded by the light of Iberia such that we neglect the experiences and voices of North African Muslims. And that's part of the idea I want to capture in the title of the book. So by leaving Iberia, I mean three things. The first is a reference to the emigration of Muslims away from Iberia. The second is a reference to the Christian Iberian conquerors who likewise left Iberia to pursue reconquest and crusade in North Africa. And third is this call to shift some of our scholarly focus away from Iberia and toward North Africa, especially as pertains to Muslims grappling with Christian conquest. So the book consists of an introduction followed by the core of the book, which is 3 case studies from the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The first case study offers a brief historical overview of the Portuguese and Spanish conquest in North Africa and presents this body of legal opinions preserved by al-Zayati that were issued in response to those conquests. The second case study is my reinterpretation of al-Matrisi's 2 1491 fatwas, al-Mahdi and the Marbella fatwa. And this is where I analyze al-Matrisi's specific legal arguments and make the case that al-Mahdi is not quite what it seems. That is, that it's ostensibly about Andalusis and the responsibility of Iberian Muslims to emigrate, but that al-Matrisi in that text is actually just as or more concerned with Portuguese occupation in the Maghreb itself. The third case study concerns another fairly well-known text, a fatwa issued in 1504 by a jurist named al-Wahrani, who was a contemporary of al-Matrisi's in Fez. And in that text, al-Wahrani writes to the first Moriscos in Granada, that is, the first Muslims who had been forcibly converted to Christianity. And this is a really amazing, relatively short text in which al-Wahrani offers these Moriscos practical advice as to how to maintain Islamic practices in secret while avoiding detection. For example, he states that they can use mere gestures to pray if necessary, and they will not sin if they're forced to do things like pray in church or drink wine, as long as their hearts remain firm in faith and they are only doing this out of coercion. A lot has been written about al-Wahrani's text. My contribution in this section of the book is to suggest that this famous fatwa is not actually a fatwa, but that it's instead, I think, unsolicited but heartfelt letter that al-Wahrani was moved to write after he encountered a copy of an appeal for aid that the Moriscos sent to the Ottoman Sultan in 1501. These three case studies that form the core of the book present three types of responses to Christian conquest, three different kinds of responses. But they were all issued in North Africa between the 1480s and 1520s. And what I do in the fourth and final section of the book is to interrogate the different fates of these responses when we get to the modern colonial era. So in two chapters, I analyze Islamic legal responses to French conquest in early 19th century Algeria and in early 20th century Mauritania, with a particular eye toward explaining how and why the colonial era Muslim jurists made use of these earlier 15th and 16th century precedents. And what I argue is that al-Wantarisi's fatwas related to Andalusi Muslims clearly became the authoritative precedents for these later jurists on the issue of Muslim submission to Christian rule, to the exclusion of the precedents preserved by al-Zayati, and as well as al-Wahrani's advice to the Moriscos. So what I try to do is explain why. Why did al-Wantarisi's opinions win out, so to speak, when these other precedents were also available? And I propose a number of concrete reasons why the Algerian and Mauritanian jurists found al-Wantarisi's opinions so compelling and why the other fatwas essentially have little or no impact on later legal thought on this issue. Finally, at the end of the book, I include three appendices, which are my English translations of the opinions preserved by al-Zayati that I treat in the book, as well as al-Wantarisi's Esnal Matajer and his Marbella fatwa. It's a great question. It's an academic book, but I really do hope that it will be accessible to non-academics. So anyone interested in that big question that I opened with of historical precedent for Islamic legal debates on Muslim minorities might find this book of interest. And it should appeal to people interested in Christian-Muslim relations more generally, in Islamic legal history, and the history of North Africa and medieval Iberia, especially as one interconnected region within the medieval Mediterranean. So right now I'm finishing up Arabic critical editions of some of the texts related to this book. One edition is of the fatwas preserved by al-Zayati regarding the Portuguese, as well as a long fatwa by a Mauritanian jurist named al-Busadi. I'm also putting together a few sources that will appear along with those critical editions in the online companion to Leaving Iberia, which should be launched in the next few months on the Sharia source website of the program in Islamic law at Harvard Law School. I also want to be sure to note that the online companion will include a full PDF of the book, so the whole book will be freely available to anyone in the near future, which was really important to me. Beyond that, I have a few projects in the works, including one on treatises against innovations or bid'ah in the 15th and 16th century Maghreb.